In the golden atrium, I, King of Ainsworth, walked toward the woman who had sworn never to forgive me. The morning light filtered through the towering stained glass windows, casting amber and crimson shadows across the polished marble floor beneath my boots. Each step echoed in the vast chamber, a sound that seemed to mock the silence stretching between us like an unbridgeable chasm. Lady Rosalind Thornfield stood with her back to me, her midnight blue gown a stark contrast against the golden walls adorned with tapestries depicting the victories of my ancestors. 3 years had passed since I last saw her face, 3 years since the night that shattered both our worlds and left us as strangers bound only by bitter memory and unspoken regret. I am Edmund Blackthorne, 32 years of age, King of Ainsworth for 8 long years since my father's death claimed him in the prime of his reign. The crown that sits upon my head weighs heavier with each passing day, but never more so than in this moment, approaching the woman whose hatred for me burns brighter than the autumn sun streaming through these ancient windows. She turned slowly, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Time had refined her beauty rather than diminished it, though I could see the subtle scar that traced along her left temple, a reminder of that terrible night when she fled my kingdom on horseback through the darkened forests. Her emerald eyes, once filled with warmth and laughter when we were young, now held the cold fury of a winter storm. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that cut deeper than any blade. The way she emphasized my title made it sound like a curse upon her lips. "Rosalind," I replied, my own voice rougher than I intended. "You came." A bitter smile touched her lips, and she lifted her chin with that defiant grace I remembered so well. Did I have a choice? Your summons was rather insistent. The irony was not lost on me. Once, she had been welcome in these halls, had walked beside me through these very corridors as my most trusted confidant, perhaps even more. Now she stood before me like a prisoner awaiting judgment, though we both knew I was the one truly on trial here. "There are things we must discuss," I began, but she raised her hand to silence me. "Must we?" Her laugh was hollow, echoing off the vaulted ceiling above us. What could the great King Edmund possibly have to say to a traitor's daughter? What words could bridge 3 years of exile, 3 years of wondering if each sunrise would be my last? The accusation struck true, as she knew it would. I had not forgotten the way she looked at me that final night in my throne room, the moment when I chose my crown over her family's safety. The moment when I became the man she could never forgive. "I know what you think of me," I said, taking another step closer despite the warning in her eyes. "I know what that decision cost us both. Do you?" She moved away from me, her silk slippers whispering against the marble as she paced toward one of the great windows. The late autumn light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and for a moment, I was transported back to simpler times when we were children playing in the castle gardens, when the weight of kingdoms and crowns seemed as distant as the stars. "Do you truly understand what your choice cost, Edmund?" She used my given name like a weapon, stripped of all titles and formality. "You saved your precious throne, yes. You preserved the stability of Ainsworth. But tell me, was it worth it? Was keeping your crown worth destroying everything we were, everything we could have been?" I wanted to tell her about the sleepless nights that followed her departure, the way I walked these halls like a ghost haunting his own castle. I wanted to explain the impossible position I had been placed in, the choice between my kingdom's survival and her family's innocence. But the words felt inadequate, small things in the face of her pain. "You don't understand the full truth of what happened that night," I said instead, and I saw her eyes flash with renewed anger. "The truth?" She whirled to face me fully now, her composure cracking like ice beneath the weight of 3 years' worth of buried rage. "The truth is that when your Chancellor Grimwald accused my father of treason, when he claimed our family was plotting against the crown, you believed him without question. You condemned us without trial, without even granting us the courtesy of an explanation." The mention of Grimwald sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the ancient stones. My former chancellor, the man I had trusted implicitly, whose counsel had guided so many of my early decisions as king. "Rosalind, if you would only listen." "Listen?" Her voice rose, filling the golden chamber with the force of her fury. "I listened that night, Edmund. I listened as you declared my family enemies of the crown. I listened as you ordered our land seized, our titles stripped. I listened as you signed what amounted to our death warrants, all while sitting on that throne your father left you, playing at being a king. Each word was a dagger thrust, precise and devastatingly accurate. I had been young then, barely 29, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of rule and desperate to prove myself worthy of my father's legacy. Grimwald had seemed like wisdom incarnate, his years of experience a lifeline in the turbulent waters of court politics. There were threats against the kingdom, I said weakly, knowing even as the words left my lips how hollow they sounded. Evidence of sedition, letters bearing your father's seal. Letters that were forged, she interrupted, and something in her tone made me freeze. Letters that were fabricated by the very man you trusted to protect your realm. She reached into the folds of her gown and withdrew a small scroll, its edges yellowed with age and travel. My heart began to pound as she held it up, and I could see that her hands trembled slightly despite her composed demeanor. This letter reached me 6 months ago, delivered by a dying man who could no longer bear the weight of his silence. A man who once served in Grimwald's household and witnessed things that would make even a king question everything he thought he knew about loyalty and betrayal. The golden atrium seemed to grow smaller around us, the weight of her words pressing down like the stone ceiling above. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the castle coming to life, servants going about their morning duties, guards changing their watch, the normal rhythms of a kingdom that had no idea its very foundation might be built upon lies. What does it say? I asked, though part of me feared the answer more than I had ever feared any enemy's sword. She smiled then, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold satisfaction of someone about to reveal a truth that would change everything. Why don't you read it for yourself, Your Majesty? After all, it concerns you almost as much as it does my family. She extended the letter toward me, and I could see that her hand was steadier now, as if the act of finally confronting this moment had given her a strange sort of peace. I reached for the parchment, our fingers brushing briefly as I took it from her, and the contact sent a jolt through me that I tried desperately to ignore. As I unrolled the letter, I could feel her watching me intently, studying every change in my expression as I began to read the words that would forever alter my understanding of the past 3 years, and perhaps determine the course of our future. The words on the parchment swam before my eyes as I read them once, then twice, each line striking me like a physical blow. The letter was written in a hand I recognized, that of Marcus Whitmore, Grimwald's former scribe, a man I had thought died of fever 2 winters past. Yet here was his confession, dated merely 7 months ago, each word a nail in the coffin of everything I had believed about that terrible night 3 years before. I could feel Rosalind's gaze upon me as I read, could sense her watching for the moment when understanding would dawn in my expression. The letter detailed everything, the forged documents that had implicated her father, the fabricated evidence of treason, the carefully orchestrated plot that had convinced me to act against the Thornfield family. But worse than the revelation of Grimwald's deception was what came next, the truth about why he had done it. He wanted their lands, I whispered, the words barely audible in the vast chamber. The northern territories, the mining rights, the trade routes through the mountain passes. Keep reading, Rosalind said quietly, her voice now devoid of the anger that had filled it moments before. There was something else there now, something that sounded almost like pity. My hands trembled as I continued, and the final paragraphs revealed the most devastating truth of all. Grimwald had not acted alone. He had convinced other nobles, men I had trusted, that the Thornfield family posed a genuine threat to the stability of the realm. But more than that, he had manipulated me specifically because he knew of my feelings for Rosalind, knew that my judgment might be clouded when it came to her family. He used my love for you against us both, I said, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. He knew that if I believed your family threatened the kingdom, would act decisively to protect it, even if it meant destroying what we had together. Rosalind moved closer then, her footsteps soft on the marble floor. He was a clever man, your chancellor. He understood that a young king would do anything to prove himself worthy of his crown, even sacrifice his own happiness. I looked up from the letter to find her standing just an arm's length away, close enough that I could see the pain that lingered in her emerald eyes despite the years that had passed. Close enough to notice how the morning light caught the delicate curve of her jaw, the way her lips pressed together as if holding back words that had been too long unspoken. That night, I began, my voice rough with emotion, when I signed the decree ordering your family's arrest, you looked at me as if I had died right there in front of you. I have carried that look with me every day since. You did die, she replied softly. The Edmund I knew, the man I had grown to love, died the moment you chose to believe Grimwald's lies over the truth you could have seen in my eyes. The man who took his place was a stranger wearing a crown. The weight of her words settled over me like a burial shroud. I had spent 3 years telling myself that I had made the difficult but necessary choice, that sacrificing personal happiness for the greater good was the burden of kingship. But now, faced with the evidence of my own blindness, I could see the truth that Rosalind had known all along. You tried to tell me, I said, remembering that final confrontation in my throne room. That last night, you begged me to listen, to question the evidence. But I was so certain, so convinced that I was protecting the kingdom from treachery. You were protecting yourself, she corrected, and though her words were harsh, her tone held no malice. You were a young king, barely 2 years on the throne, facing your first real crisis. Grimwald offered you certainty in a world that seemed to offer only doubt and confusion. Of course you took it. I folded the letter carefully, as if the parchment were made of the most delicate silk rather than the rough paper that had traveled so far to reach us. How did you survive? I asked. After you fled that night, where did you go? How did you live? For the first time since our conversation began, I saw her composure waver slightly. She turned away from me, moving back toward the great windows that looked out over the castle courtyard where even now I could see servants going about their morning tasks, unaware that their king's world was crumbling around him. I rode north, she said, her voice distant as if she were seeing those dark roads again. I had a cousin in Scotland, my mother's sister's daughter, who had married a Highland lord. I thought if I could reach them, I might find sanctuary until the storm passed. She paused, and I could see her reflection in the glass, the way her hand moved unconsciously to touch the scar at her temple. I barely made it past the border. Grimwald had sent men after me, ostensibly to bring me back for trial, but their orders were clear enough. A trader's daughter fleeing in the night would be easy enough to explain away as an accident. My blood ran cold at her words. They tried to kill you. One of them succeeded in wounding me, she said, turning back to face me. This scar is a reminder of how close I came to joining my father in whatever fate you had planned for him. Rosalind, I swear to you, I never ordered your death. When Grimwald told me you had fled, I was relieved. I thought perhaps you would find safety somewhere beyond my reach, somewhere you could build a new life. And my father? Her voice was steady, but I could hear the pain beneath it. What became of him while I was building this new life you speak of? This was the question I had dreaded most, the one that cut deepest because I knew there was no answer that could absolve me of what had happened. He died in the tower 3 months after your escape, I said quietly. Officially, it was fever, but I know now that Grimwald likely had him poisoned to prevent him from revealing the truth about the forged evidence. I watched her face crumble slightly at the confirmation of what she had probably suspected all along. Her father, Lord Thomas Thornfield, had been a good man, an honorable nobleman who had served my father faithfully for decades. To learn that his death had been nothing more than the elimination of an inconvenient witness to Grimwald's treachery was a blow that I could see strike her with physical force. I'm sorry, I said, the words pitifully inadequate for the magnitude of what had been done. I am so deeply, truly sorry for all of it. For believing Grimwald's lies, for not trusting in what I knew of your family's character, for allowing fear to cloud my judgment when lives hung in the balance. She wiped away a single tear that had escaped despite her efforts at composure, and I felt my heart break anew at the sight. Your apologies won't bring him back, Edmund. They won't give me back those 3 years of exile, of wondering if I would ever see my homeland again, of mourning not just my father's death but the loss of everything I had believed about the man I loved. The past tense of that final word hit me like a sword thrust. Had loved. Whatever feeling she had once harbored for me had died with her father in that cold tower cell, had been buried beneath 3 years of pain and exile and the bitter knowledge that the man she trusted above all others had been the architect of her family's destruction. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, I said, taking a step closer despite the warning in her eyes. But I need you to know that not a day has passed when I haven't regretted that decision, when I haven't wondered what might have been different if I had trusted my heart instead of my counselors. And what would you have me do with that knowledge? She asked. Am I supposed to forgive you simply because you've finally learned the truth? Am I supposed to forget the price we both paid for your willingness to believe the worst of those who loved you most? Before I could answer her question, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor beyond the atrium. Heavy boots on stone, moving with purpose and authority. Rosalind tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the hidden dagger I was certain she carried, a precaution learned during 3 years of exile and uncertainty. Your Majesty, came a voice I recognized with growing dread. Lord Chancellor Matthias Grimwald himself, the architect of our shared misery, approached through the arched doorway with his usual air of calculated deference. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of face that inspired trust in those who didn't know to look for the cold calculation behind his pale blue eyes. Chancellor, I replied, my voice carefully neutral despite the rage building in my chest. I could feel Rosalind's tension beside me, could sense her preparing to flee or fight depending on how this encounter unfolded. Grimwald's gaze moved from me to Rosalind, and I saw recognition flash across his features, followed immediately by what looked almost like satisfaction. "Lady Thornfield," he said with a bow that mocked courtesy. "How unexpected to find you gracing our halls once again. I was under the impression that exile had taken you far from our borders." "Careful, Chancellor," I warned, taking a step that placed me slightly between him and Rosalind. "Lady Thornfield is here at my invitation." "Of course, Your Majesty," he replied smoothly, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "Though I must say, the timing is rather interesting. We've had reports of unusual activity along our northern borders, riders moving under cover of darkness, messages being passed between parties unknown. One might wonder if there's some connection." It was masterfully done, I had to admit. With just a few carefully chosen words, he had managed to cast suspicion on Rosalind's return, to suggest that her presence here was part of some larger threat to the kingdom. 3 years ago, I would have taken his concerns seriously, would have demanded explanations and proof of loyalty. Now, however, I could see the manipulation for what it was. "What exactly are you suggesting, Chancellor?" I asked, my tone growing colder. "Nothing specific, Your Majesty," he replied, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Merely that we should be cautious about whom we trust, especially given recent events. The kingdom has enjoyed 3 years of peace and prosperity since the Thornfield matter was resolved. It would be unfortunate to see that stability threatened by old loyalties or misplaced sentiment." I felt Rosalind stiffen beside me at his words, and I could imagine the effort it was taking her to remain silent in the face of such casual dismissal of her family's destruction. But there was something else in Grimwald's manner, a confidence that suggested he knew more about her return than he was letting on. "Tell me, Chancellor," I said, my voice deceptively calm, "what do you know of Marcus Whitmore?" The change in Grimwald's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The mask of concerned loyalty slipped just slightly, revealing a flash of something that might have been surprise or perhaps calculation. "Whitmore, Your Majesty? I'm afraid I don't understand the relevance. The man died of fever over 2 years ago." "Did he?" I asked, and I saw Rosalind glance at me with what might have been approval. "Because I have it on good authority that he was alive and well as recently as 7 months ago. Grimwald's recovery was swift, I had to give him that." Within moments, his expression had returned to its usual mask of dignified concern. "I fear someone has been spreading false information, Your Majesty. Perhaps this is connected to the suspicious activities I mentioned. Enemies of the crown often use such tactics to sow discord and confusion." "Show him the letter," I said to Rosalind, and I saw Grimwald's eyes sharpen with interest. She hesitated for a moment, and I could understand her reluctance. The letter was her only proof, her one piece of evidence that could vindicate her family's honor and expose the truth of what had happened 3 years ago. To reveal it now, in front of the very man it accused, was a considerable risk. "What letter might that be?" Grimwald asked, his tone carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had moved to clasp behind his back in a gesture I now recognized as a sign of his discomfort. Rosalind looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her weighing the risks and benefits of this revelation. Then, with a decisiveness that reminded me of the courage she had shown that night 3 years ago when she faced my accusations with her head held high, she withdrew the letter from her gown and held it out toward Grimwald. "Perhaps you recognize the handwriting, my Lord Chancellor," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Your former scribe had quite a distinctive style." Grimwald took the letter with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, and I watched his face as he read. It was fascinating to observe, like watching a master actor struggle to maintain his performance even as the stage collapsed around him. His pale eyes moved across the parchment with increasing speed, and I could see sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "This is clearly a forgery," he said finally, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Some enemy of the crown seeking to destabilize your reign by casting doubt on past decisions. Your Majesty, surely you can see the danger in giving credence to such obvious fabrications." "Fabrications?" Rosalind's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Like the ones you created to destroy my family? Like the forged letters bearing my father's seal that convinced the king to order our arrest?" Grimwald's mask finally slipped completely, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw the real man beneath the facade. His eyes grew cold and calculating, and when he spoke, his voice held none of its usual deference. Your family was a threat to the stability of the realm, he said, abandoning all pretense. Your father's liberal ideas about reducing noble privileges, his support for expanding trade with our enemies, his influence over a young and impressionable king. Someone had to act to protect Ainsworth from such dangerous thinking. The admission hung in the air between us like a physical presence. After 3 years of questions and doubts, here was the truth laid bare in all its ugly simplicity. Grimwald had destroyed the Thornfield family not because they were traitors, but because they represented change he could not control. You killed an innocent man, I said, my voice growing dangerous. You destroyed a loyal family and poisoned the trust between a king and his subjects, all to protect your own position and influence. I protected the kingdom, Grimwald replied, his chin lifting with defiant pride. I ensured that traditional values and proper order were maintained. If you were too young and foolish to see the threat the Thornfields represented, then it fell to wiser heads to act on your behalf. The sheer arrogance of his words struck me like a physical blow. Here was a man who had manipulated me, who had used my youth and inexperience to further his own agenda, now standing before me and claiming it had all been for my own good. Guards, I called, my voice echoing through the golden atrium with an authority I had never fully claimed before this moment. Arrest Lord Chancellor Grimwald on charges of treason, fraud, and murder. The sound of running feet answered my call, but Grimwald made no move to flee. Instead, he smiled, a cold expression that sent ice through my veins. You think it's that simple, Your Majesty? He asked. You think you can simply reverse 3 years of decisions because a traitor's daughter brings you a piece of parchment? The nobles who supported the action against the Thornfields will not simply accept that they were deceived. Your own credibility as a ruler hangs in the balance. He was right, and we all knew it. To admit that I had been so thoroughly manipulated, that I had condemned an innocent family based on fabricated evidence, would shake the very foundations of my authority. The other nobles would question every decision I had made, would wonder what other lies they had been told. But as my guards entered the atrium, their armor clanking against the marble floor, Grimwald's confident smile began to fade. These were not the same men who had served under his influence 3 years ago. Captain William Ashford, my most trusted guard, stepped forward with a grim expression that suggested he had heard more of our conversation than I had realized. Your Majesty, Ashford said, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled anger, we've been investigating certain irregularities in the kingdom's records, as you requested last month. What we found corroborates what Lady Thornfield has presented. I felt a surge of gratitude toward the captain, a man whose loyalty had never wavered even when my own judgment had proven so fallible. Unknown to Grimwald, I had begun my own quiet investigation into the events of 3 years past, driven by doubts that had never fully quieted despite my attempts to bury them. What irregularities? Grimwald demanded, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. Financial records showing payments made to forgers in the capital, Ashford replied evenly. Correspondence with mercenaries hired to pursue Lady Thornfield during her escape. And perhaps most damning, records of land transfers that occurred suspiciously soon after the Thornfield properties were seized. I watched as the color drained from Grimwald's face. He had been thorough in his deception, but even the most careful criminal leaves traces of his crimes. Who received those land grants, Chancellor? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Various loyal nobles who had served the crown faithfully, he replied, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. Your brother-in-law, Lord Pemberton, received the mining rights to the Northern Territories, Captain Ashford continued relentlessly. Your nephew was granted the trade route licenses. Your own holdings mysteriously expanded to include several of the most profitable Thornfield properties. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? The web of corruption was more extensive than even I had imagined. Grimwald had not acted alone in his greed, but had involved his family and allies in the systematic plundering of the Thornfield estate. The scope of the betrayal left me feeling sick to my stomach. This is all circumstantial, Grimwald said, but his voice now carried the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. Correlation is not causation. The fact that loyal servants of the crown benefited from the redistribution of traitors' lands proves nothing. Perhaps not, I agreed, and I saw hope flicker in his eyes before I continued. But Marcus Whitmore's confession provides rather specific details about your instructions to him. Details about which documents to forge, which seals to replicate, even which phrases to use to make the treason charges most convincing. Rosalind had remained silent throughout this exchange, but I could see in her expression a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Vindication for her family's innocence, but sorrow for the years lost, for her father who would never see his name cleared, for the trust that had been shattered between us. Your Majesty, Grimwald said, making one final attempt to salvage his position, even if there were irregularities in how the Thornfield matter was handled, you must consider the greater good. The kingdom has prospered under your rule. The people are content. To disrupt that stability now, to admit to such fundamental errors in judgment, could destabilize everything we've built. It was his last card to play, the appeal to pragmatism over justice. 3 years ago, I might have been swayed by such arguments. The younger man who had sat on the throne, overwhelmed by the weight of kingship and desperate to maintain order, might have chosen the safe path of continued deception. But I was no longer that frightened young king. The weight of the crown had taught me that true stability could never be built on foundations of lies and injustice. A kingdom that prospered through the destruction of innocent families was not a kingdom worth preserving. Captain Ashford, I said, my voice ringing with an authority I had never felt more certain of, arrest the former chancellor on the charges I have named. He will face trial before the full court, where all evidence against him will be presented. As the guards moved to take Grimwald into custody, he turned to look at me one final time. You're making a mistake, Edmund, he said, dropping all pretense of royal address. Your father would never have been so foolish as to let sentiment override political necessity. My father, I replied coldly, would never have been deceived by a snake like you in the first place. He understood that honor and justice are not luxuries a king can afford to abandon when they become inconvenient. As Grimwald was led away, his protests echoing through the corridors, I found myself alone with Rosalind once again. The golden atrium seemed somehow brighter now, as if the removal of Grimwald's presence had lifted a shadow that had hung over us throughout our conversation. Thank you, she said quietly, and I could see that she was struggling to maintain her composure. For 3 years, I've carried the weight of knowing my family died in disgrace, branded as traitors to the crown we had served faithfully for generations. To finally see that stain removed, to know that history will remember my father as the honorable man he was. Her voice broke slightly, and I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort her, to bridge the gap that still yawned between us despite the truth that had finally been revealed. But I knew that justice for her family was only the first step in a much longer journey toward redemption. There will be more, I promised her. Full pardons for your family, restoration of your titles and lands, compensation for the years of exile you endured. Nothing I can do will bring back your father or erase the pain of what happened, but I can ensure that the kingdom acknowledges the wrong that was done. She nodded, wiping away tears she had fought so hard to contain. And what of us, Edmund? What of the future that was stolen from us along with everything else? It was the question I had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. The revelation of Grimwald's treachery had cleared her family's name and exposed the lies that had driven us apart, but it could not simply erase 3 years of pain and separation. It could not bring back the trust that had been shattered or heal the wounds that had been carved into both our hearts. I don't know, I admitted, and the honesty of that admission felt both terrifying and liberating. I know that I love you still, that my feelings for you never wavered even when I believed the lies about your family. But I also know that love alone cannot undo the damage that has been done. She studied my face with those emerald eyes that had haunted my dreams for 3 years, searching for something I could only hope she would find. You're different, she said finally. The young king who condemned my family was acting out of fear and inexperience. The man standing before me now understands the true weight of the crown he wears. Suffering has a way of teaching lessons that nothing else can, I replied. Losing you, carrying the guilt of what I had done, learning to rule with the knowledge that my first major decision had been catastrophically wrong. It changed me in ways I'm still discovering. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching voices echoed from the corridor. Members of the court, drawn by the commotion of Grimwald's arrest, were no doubt seeking answers about what had transpired. Soon, we would be surrounded by nobles and advisors demanding explanations, by the machinery of government that never ceased its turning regardless of personal revelations or private reconciliations. Walk with me, I said, offering her my arm. There are others who need to hear this story, decisions that must be made about how to proceed. But I want you beside me when those decisions are made. Not as a supplicant seeking justice, but as someone whose counsel I value above all others. She hesitated for a moment, and I could see her weighing the implications of that gesture. To take my arm, to walk beside me through the halls of the castle, would be to signal something to the court, to suggest a relationship that went beyond the mere clearing of her family's name. Then slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand upon my arm. The gesture was small, but its significance reverberated through me like the tolling of cathedral bells. Together, we walked from the golden atrium toward the great hall where the assembled nobles waited, where the future of the kingdom would be shaped by the truths we were about to reveal. The great hall of Ainsworth Castle had witnessed countless moments of history, but as we entered that autumn morning, I felt the weight of this particular moment settling around us like a mantle. The assembled nobles turned as one to watch our approach, their faces reflecting curiosity, concern, and in some cases, barely concealed alarm at the sight of Lady Rosalind Thornfield walking beside their king. Lord Pemberton, Grimwald's brother-in-law, stepped forward with an expression of manufactured concern. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of worried loyalty, "we heard there was some disturbance. Is everything quite all right?" I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the same cold opportunism that had driven his participation in Grimwald's scheme. But now, with the truth finally revealed, his position had become far more precarious than he realized. "Lord Pemberton," I replied, my voice carrying easily through the vast chamber, "I'm afraid there has indeed been a disturbance. One that has revealed some very uncomfortable truths about events that occurred 3 years past." A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles, and I could see various expressions of confusion, concern, and in a few cases, what looked suspiciously like guilt. How many of them had known? How many had suspected the truth but chosen to remain silent for the sake of their own advancement? "Your Majesty," Lord Hawthorne called out from near the great fireplace, "surely whatever has transpired can be resolved quietly, without unnecessary upheaval. The kingdom has enjoyed such peace and prosperity lately." "Peace built on lies is no peace at all," Rosalind said, her voice clear and strong as it carried through the hall. "Prosperity gained through the destruction of innocent families is blood money." The silence that followed her words was absolute. For 3 years, these nobles had accepted the official story of the Thornfield family's treason, had divided up their lands and titles among themselves without questioning too deeply the evidence that had condemned them. Now, faced with the living reminder of their complicity, they shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "Lady Thornfield speaks the truth," I announced, and I could feel the shock ripple through the assembled court. 3 years ago, I was deceived by fabricated evidence into believing that her family posed a threat to the crown. Today, that deception has been exposed, and those responsible will face justice. Lord Pemberton's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "Your Majesty, surely you're not suggesting that the evidence against the Thornfields was somehow illegitimate?" The Chancellor himself assured us of its authenticity. "The Chancellor," I replied with cold satisfaction, "has just been arrested for treason, fraud, and murder." His assurances, as it turns out, were worth precisely as much as the forged documents he used to destroy an innocent family. The hall erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shock, denial, and in some cases, what sounded like panic as various nobles realized the implications of what I had revealed. If Grimwald's evidence had been fabricated, if the Thornfield family's innocence was proven, then everyone who had benefited from their downfall was potentially complicit in the conspiracy. "Order!" I commanded, my voice cutting through the tumult with an authority that surprised even me. "There will be a full investigation into all aspects of this matter. Those who were deceived, as I was, have nothing to fear. But those who knowingly participated in this conspiracy against innocent subjects of the crown will face the full weight of royal justice." Captain Ashford appeared at my side, his presence lending additional weight to my words. "Your Majesty," he said in a voice loud enough for all to hear, "our investigation has revealed extensive financial records documenting payments for forged documents, bribes to secure false testimony, and the systematic redistribution of Thornfield properties to specific individuals." I watched as several nobles exchanged nervous glances, no doubt wondering how deep the investigation had gone and what evidence might have been uncovered about their own involvement. Lord Pemberton, in particular, looked as if he might be sick. "However," I continued, raising my hand for silence, "I am not interested in pursuing vengeance for its own sake. What I want is justice, truth, and restitution for the wrongs that have been done. Lady Thornfield's family will be fully pardoned and their honor restored. Their lands and titles will be returned, and appropriate compensation will be made for the years of exile they endured. Your Majesty," Lord Hawthorne ventured carefully, "while we all support justice, surely such dramatic reversals of established policy could destabilize the kingdom. Perhaps a more gradual approach." "Justice delayed is justice denied," Rosalind said firmly, and I felt a surge of pride at her courage in speaking truth to power. "My father died in a prison cell, branded a traitor, while the real criminals divided up his lands among themselves. No amount of gradual adjustment can undo that wrong. Lady Thornfield is correct, I said, turning to face the assembled nobles directly. For too long, this kingdom has prioritized stability over justice, political convenience over moral courage. That ends today. I could see that my words were having an effect, that the assembled nobles were beginning to understand that this was not merely about the Thornfield family, but about the kind of kingdom we would choose to be going forward. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful, but all were paying attention in a way they had not done in years. Furthermore, I continued, I am announcing my intention to marry Lady Rosalind Thornfield, with her consent, and to make her my queen. The second eruption of shocked voices was even louder than the first, but I barely heard it. All my attention was focused on Rosalind, on the expression of surprise and something that might have been hope that crossed her beautiful face. Your Majesty, she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the chaos around us, are you certain? To marry the daughter of a family you once condemned, even knowing the truth now, will be seen by many as an admission of weakness. On the contrary, I replied, taking her hands in mine before the entire assembled court, I can think of no greater demonstration of strength than the courage to admit when one has been wrong, and to choose love over political expedience. She searched my eyes for a long moment, and I could see her weighing not just her own feelings, but the implications of what I was asking. To become queen of a kingdom that had condemned her family, to stand beside the man whose signature had ordered their destruction, even knowing he had been deceived, would require a kind of forgiveness that few could manage. Yes, she said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I will marry you, Edmund. Not because I have forgotten the pain of the past 3 years, but because I choose to believe in the possibility of a better future. The kiss we shared in that moment, before the entire court of Ainsworth, sealed more than just our personal reconciliation. It was a promise to the kingdom that justice and truth would no longer be sacrificed for the sake of convenience, that love and honor would guide our decisions rather than fear and political calculation. As we broke apart, I could see tears in Rosalind's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Around us, the chaos of the court had given way to something that might have been wonder, as if the nobles were witnessing something they had thought impossible. In the days that followed, there would be trials and investigations, restitutions and reforms. Some nobles would be found guilty of corruption and face the consequences of their actions. Others would be cleared of wrongdoing and welcomed back into the circle of royal trust. But all would understand that the kingdom had changed, that the price of injustice had become too high to pay. Most importantly, I had learned that true kingship was not about maintaining power at any cost, but about having the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. And standing beside me through all of it would be the woman whose love had taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the personal cost. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. And if this story of redemption and second chances moved you, please subscribe to hear more tales of love conquering even the greatest obstacles. Sometimes the most powerful lesson we can learn is that it's never too late to choose truth over comfort, love over fear, and justice over political convenience.